Assalamu alaikum guys, this is your Arabic teacher Sam and a very warm welcome back to another video. This evening, just before I was going to go out and visit some of my students, some Libyan students who I teach in Truro, I had an email request from a student who wanted tuition, and her name's Nouran, so very big shout out to you. And she said she wanted some tuition because her Arabic speaking GCSE exam is coming up on the 27th, inshallah. So I wanted to do a little video for any other of you guys who are doing like speaking tests soon, because obviously you need to make your language sound like it's a lot more fasih, that it's a lot more kind of formal, rather than being your kind of amiyya that you speak at home. Amiyya being like what is normal, like dialects and colloquial stuff people speak at home. A bit like in English when we have our slang and stuff like that. So what I wanted to do is I want to give you 10 top tips. This video is specifically for Nouran, but I mean, hopefully other people will benefit from it too. So first thing to really appreciate is that in Arabic, because there's this kind of dichotomy between like Fusha and like MSA, like standard Arabic, and Amiyya, the things that are spoken kind of more casually in your home and stuff, and there's quite a big difference between those two languages. So things that are really commonly heard in Amiyya, if there's an alternative that is in Fusha, that would be considered more formal. Just because it's an alternative, like it's as much to do with it just being different to Amiyya than that it's actually Fusha. So you might, for example, you might have two words for the word tomorrow, like bukra and ghadan are both perfectly acceptable Fusha words. They both exist and they're both Fusha. But bukra is used so often in Amiyya that it's seen as a little bit less formal. So I'll kind of be sensitive to those things a little bit in this video, inshallah. So the first one for us to get straight into is in Amiyya, especially like in Egypt, I've heard particularly among Egyptians, is for saying like isn't that so? Is that right? Like to say someone, is that right? They say like mushkida. I've heard like mushkida. But in Fusha it's much better to take your mushkida and make it alaysa kadhalik. Alaysa kadhalik. That sounds very fasih. That's a real level up in your GCSE exam. Rather than saying mushkida, saying alaysa kadhalik, that sounds very fasih. The second tip is very easy, is to take, whenever you're talking about the subject of a sentence, so if you were saying the Muslims, for example, rather than saying muslimin, use muslimun. And even when you're saying the word ashara, rather than saying, when you're saying the word 20, sorry, ishreen, say ishrun, if it's appropriate. Because this una ending, even though ina and una for like plural nouns, for the ending for plural nouns, like muslimina, mu'minin, you know, the kafirin, loads of other words like that. Even though ina is perfectly acceptable in Fusha, like there are times when you use it in Fusha, una is never used in Amiyya. So it's seen as a little bit more fasih. So that's kind of tip number 2. In a speaking exam, it'd be really helpful to say to the examiner in Arabic that you don't understand. And a really common way of doing that in Amiyya is just to say something like mish fahim, and mish fahim. But it sounds a lot better if you'd say something like lam afham. Lam afham. Because what you've done with the verb is you've made it majzoom, and that sounds a lot better rather than using kind of you know, rather than using a fa'il of the verb. It just sounds a lot better to say lam afham. Lam afham. Or if you're not sure about something, to say ana lastu mutaakkidan. That sounds really fasih as well. It shows you've understood using the verb laysa as well. So remember those just as phrases and maybe just reel them off in your exam. So lam afham means like I didn't understand, and ana lastu mutaakkidan is like I'm not sure about that. Tip number 4 is the use of some really common verbs. So saying that you think something, or that you like or you love something. So normally in the past tense in Amiyya, people who speak like a dialect, they would normally say ana habbit, like I loved something or I liked something. Ana habbit, that's say I liked something. Or if they thought something, they'd say ana dhannit. But with these verbs, that's not really the correct way to use it. If you were to make the conscious effort in your exam, instead of saying ana habbit, to say ana ahbabtu, then that would sound very fasih. Like it would really level up your Arabic and make it a bit more formal. And likewise with the verb dhanna, rather than saying ana dhannit, it sounds a lot more formal and really level it up if you would say ana dhanantu, and ana ahbabtu. So that was tip number 4. So let's move on to tip number 5. Tip number 5 is one which I kind of touched on at the beginning of the lesson. So it'd be using, when you're talking about tomorrow, saying ghadan rather than bukra. Just because bukra sounds I mean, bukra just sounds a bit more amiyya, even though, as I said at the beginning of the video, it is actually a fusha word. You will find it in dictionaries and stuff. Because it's used so often in amiyya, it's seen as a little bit less formal. So it's a very easy little adjustment in your language, just to say ghadan instead of bukra. Tip number 6 is to use this when you're talking about seeing something, to use the verb ra'a rather than shuf. I know it's very common in amiyya for people to say ana shufit, like I saw something, ana shufit. Yeah, just ana shufit. I saw something. But if you say the fusha, you say ana ra'aytu. Ana ra'aytu, like I saw something. Ana ra'aytu shay'an, rather than the amiyya equivalent, which would be something like ana shufit shi. Ana shufit shi. Ana ra'aytu shay'an sounds a lot more kind of high register. And again, it's quite an easy little adjustment just to memorize some of these phrases that I'm giving you. I'll maybe write them in the description as well, so you can have a written copy of them too. Tip number 7 would be to stop using this verb raha, to go somewhere. I know that in amiyya it's very common for people to say like ana rahit, I went somewhere, or ana baruh, or ana rayih, I'm going somewhere, ana rayih. I've heard that a lot. So rather than saying that, saying the verb dhahaba, it sounds a lot more fusha. This verb dhahaba is very, very rarely used in Arabic, if ever. Like I've never heard it in Egypt, never heard it in Palestine, never heard it among the Libyans that I teach, and never actually heard it in any other dialect. I'll be really interested, by the way, if any of you speak a dialect and you use this verb dhahaba regularly and you don't see it as like really formal, then let me know in the comments below. So saying dhahaba, so for example, if you're going to say I went somewhere, like I went to the mosque, for example, أنا ذهبت إلى المسجد. أنا ذهبت إلى المسجد, rather than something like أنا رحت إلى المسجد, something like that, like you might say in Egypt, or أنا رحت إلى الدكان مثلا, for example. So that was tip number 7, I think. Tip number 8 is to do your very, very best not to end asma, adjectives and nouns and stuff, with a sukoon, because they very, very rarely end with a sukoon. And it's so typical of Amiyya speakers that I teach, even when they do writing for me, to put sukoons on the end of everything, because that's how people speak in Amiyya. But it's a habit that's really important to get out of, because just they never end in sukoons. In actual fusha, if you've understood the grammar of them, so do your very best not to. Like a really good rule to remember, which will eliminate a lot of the sukoons that you use on the end of nouns, will just be to remember after prepositions you use a kasra. So for the example that I gave you earlier, when I said أنا ذهبت إلى المسجد, that I deliberately did that because I thought like you'd realize, most people watching this, you'd realize like masjidi sounds a bit odd, because people don't normally say that, but after prepositions, it's a really good idea to do that. You'll get away with it on the end of sentences, but it's really, really good habit to get into, actually saying the endings of nouns. Tip number 9 is to try your very, very best to avoid dialect stuff of your country in terms of pronunciation. So a few really good keys to go by, like first of all, for the Saudi brothers and sisters, my wife, she was raised in Saudi Arabia, and she says things like Shukhbarich. This ch sound does not exist in Fusha. There's no ch in Fusha. I remember when I was in Palestine and I met someone who was from a village, and he said to me, chirfinit, which is meant to be like, well, it would actually be like kayfa enter or something like that. It would translate to in Fusha. It said chirfinit. So avoid saying ch sound for anything. So the next one is for the Libyans. Obviously I teach them Libyans, and I know that qaf ends up being g. So rather than saying like qamarun, they say gmar. Or rather than being qalamun, it becomes glam, which is actually a pencil in Libyan Arabic. But really, really try to avoid that. For Egyptians, though, obviously it's well known across the Arab world that your jeems become g, and I even said it earlier, instead of masjid, you'd make it like masjid, the Egyptians, but please avoid that. Like, do your very, very best to avoid that, because making your Arabic sound a bit more formal, it's just really helpful to avoid it. That's just all it is. Tip number 10 is to go out of your way to use la instead of ma when you're using negative verbs. So rather than saying something like ma badakhinsh, like I don't smoke, ma badakhinsh, that's not how you say la udakhin. It's la udakhinu. Yeah, that's how you say it in Fusha. So use la instead of ma with verbs. So just a few more examples, just so you can maybe write them down, or things that might be useful for you. Rather than saying like ma bashrabsh, something like that, you say la ashrabu. Or rather than saying أنا ما باكل. أنا ما باكل. Like I don't eat something. أنا ما باكل شيء. لا آكل شيئا. So those are all of the tips from me for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then don't forget to like and share it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions at all for Sam, your Arabic teacher, then please just stick them in the comments below, and I'll definitely get back to you, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.